Dr. Erfan Ali, Head of the United Nations Human Settlements Programme, Trey Hicks, Director of Food for Peace at USAID, David Harden, who's the Managing Director of the Georgetown Strategy Group, Dr. Mohammed Abdikar, IOM Regional Director for East and Horn of Africa, Dr. Tanjina Mercer, the Co-CEO Interim Chief Programs Officer at Plan International Canada, Dr. Hegazi Idris Ibrahim, who's the Regional Program Specialist in Basic Education at UNESCO, and Bogdan Dumitru, IMC Director of International Programme. And finally, let me introduce you to the moderator of this panel, Mukesh Kapila, who's Professor of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester. He also has extensive experience in global health, humanitarian affairs, conflict and security, international development, human rights and diplomacy. He also has qualifications in medicine, public health and development from the universities of Oxford and London. So please welcome the panel. The floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And firstly, I'm very, very conscious that we only have one lady in this panel, but I'm comforted by the fact that in the previous panel, we had a predominant of women. So taking the two together, I think we may be moving towards gender equality, because I think gender equality is such an important aspect of our work, and everything we do must be guided by that wherever we are. Now, to our topic. This session is about evidence-based humanitarian action and innovation. Why is this important? Well, we live in a world of multiple crises, multiple fakeries, and multiple panics, if you like. So, you know, in a world where we have locusts and plagues, and in this case, a plague of viruses, and we have floods and droughts and wars and displacements, refugees and food insecurity, and so on and so forth. It's utterly vital that we keep a cool head, that we only do what is right and we only do what works. And being evidence-based in our work is not just an issue of making better use of our limited resources or making the dollar go further, but it is a moral duty, because every time we work in a way that is ineffective, it costs lives. So the reason for having evidence-based action is because it is the best way, it is the only way where we can do the maximum good, and we have a moral and ethical responsibility to do that. And on innovation, because we live in a world which is fast changing, where yesterday's solutions are not totally able to solve today's problems, and because if we don't find new ways of addressing complexity, which is that different risks in different parts of the world are interconnecting, so the sum of 2 plus 2 doesn't make 4, it makes 5. Therefore, we have to actually find ways of countering multiple risks, interconnected risks, and of course in a globalized, changing world. Now, the approach we're going to take in this panel is that we have got one colleague, Dominic Heinrich from the World Food Programme in Rome, who will join us by Skype or video link and will talk to us first. And then subsequently, we will go from in a different in relevant order, not necessarily the order in which people are sitting. And each speaker will have about a couple of minutes to get their core point across. And then I will question them. And then, of course, I hope we will have time for some interactions towards the end. So the audience, my message to the audience is, get your questions ready right now. Otherwise, you know what will happen. We'll run out of time, and then I'll be forced to apologize to you. So get your questions in time, get it written, and indeed, if they can be passed to the case relief staff, they might even be brought to my early attention, so I can also integrate your questions, even as the panel is speaking, and interrupt the panel to ask those questions. So get ready. But let me start first by welcoming you, Dominic Heinrich, in Rome. where you work on innovation and evidence-based approaches in presumably food security. So look forward to your remarks. Over to you.
Dr. Kapila, thank you very much for the introductions. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Super. I apologize for not being there. I do that out of respect to the audience, and I exercise a bit of restraint because I have a cold, and with the coronavirus, Dr. Kapila, you know better than I, it's better that I participate throughout the panel from remote. I thank you for the introductions, and 2 points I would like to make on evidence-based innovation. One, people-centered, and I want to draw on the experience that we had in Lebanon with the fantastic colleagues of UNHCR, with UNICEF, and the World Food Programme serving 1 million refugees there. It was an operation where I had the honor to serve for 3 years, and it was purely evidence-based. We had data on the beneficiaries. We were receiving input from shops on what they would be buying through the cash-based transfers, and all of that information allowed for a better programming in real time. So using the evidence of what we were doing in real time, together with all the other colleagues on the ground, in a situation where one person out of 5 in the country was a refugee. This allowed to treat people not only as beneficiaries, but treat them as customers, treat them as with a dignity that was of a different kind. And sometimes, you know, there is a hype on innovation. The term innovation is abused. And basing ourselves on evidence and demonstrating that we're not doing innovation for the innovation's sake, but in service to the hungry poor or to the most affected populations, I think is a first cornerstone. The second point I wanted to make is in WFP we have embarked in digital transformation as a priority. And there, if you think of tools like the Hunger Map, that harvests from various sources that are public, information on food security, on weather, on economic factors, on vulnerability, and in real time provides WFP with the elements for a more modern programming, for a more modern design of its interventions. I think those are elements that simply don't put innovation there, but base ourselves on facts, on hard data, and lead us towards data-based decision-making. The last point on evidence-based programming, again in Lebanon, we started a program. At the time we call it digital food. Now we call it Impact, where we taught beneficiaries digital skills, basic digital skills. And we basically created through that the nexus between a humanitarian intervention and a social safety net, or livelihoods creation. In a world where there is a huge demand for digital machine learning-based activities, associating a name to a street, associating a face to a name 1 million times. And at the same time, having in many countries vulnerable people that have basic digital skills and bringing those to a next level and combining the offer and demand, this type of interventions allowed us to bring tens of thousands of people into the modern labor market. So I wanted to bring you these 3 examples that are either based on a humanitarian activity or based on the digital transformation and having sophisticated methods of data gathering and database decision making. And the third one creating a nexus between humanitarian and development activities through, call it innovation, call it evidence-based, call it modernizing the way we do the programming, always centered around people. This is something that at the World Food Programme, and together with other colleagues in the UN system and NGO world, and of course host governments, we are passionate about. We're striving to do every day better than the previous day, and I thank you again for having me on this panel. Over.
Dominic, thank you very much indeed. Now, I've been watching WFP for many years, initially as a funder, give you a lot of money, plus then various programs. What you say is great, and watching WFP's transformation, WFP is a very important organization in the humanitarian ecosystem, and all the examples you gave are great. However, do you have evidence, or are you collecting evidence to say that those activities are making you more efficient and that you are, in a sense, bringing greater nutrition security, food security to marginalized and vulnerable people around the world? Can you measure them? I'm not saying I need the data now, but in sense of, as you said, it's a very overhyped word, evidence-based and innovation. Can you prove it that you're making a difference?
Dr. Kapila, I think we prove it more and more. You have the executive director of WFP now has a dashboard with which he elegantly follows each of our 83 country offices on key data. Those are not all the data, and those key data inform how we adjust programs. And the cycle of this improvement or this change or this adaptation of the programs is still treasuring processes like evaluations, processes like performance metrics that are based on annual performance reports. But at the same time, the people on the ground, the colleagues, are able to adjust these programs in much tighter iterations. Now, providing then this information to the external world as evidence, that and in a distilled way, that is our challenge in not leading to a proliferation of endless KPIs that then again lead to confusion, to lack of transparency. You mentioned in the opening of your opening remarks that there's a lot of fake news and in a world where there is a surplus of information, we internally in our work experience the same. So this is why I am giving you a bit of an ambivalent answer. On the one hand, we have a very tight focus on evidence-based decision-making, on data-based decision-making, and providing that evidence of efficiency possibly to the donors and to the community in general. On the other hand, we have to have an intelligent and very rigorous way of identifying those key performance indicators that then allow us to have that serenity of decisions as opposed to a nebulous and overwhelming amount of information.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to you, Dominic. Thanks, but don't go away. Stay with us. But I'm very glad you brought the last point, and which is possibly the greatest challenge in the humanitarian sector is a crisis in trust and confidence. And I think this is why I cannot think of a more important sort of example of how do we regain that, so that we can regain the consensus around humanitarian action, which is vital if we are to address the most terrible problems of the age. And to think more about that and other things, I have my second distinguished speaker, who's Trey Hicks, who's the director of the USAID Office of Food and Peace. Trey, the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you for hosting this conference and for moderating this panel. This is actually a very important priority for the U.S. government writ large, as well as my agency at USAID. I think a common theme that's been coming out of this conference is that the needs and the funding, there's an increasing gap. The needs are increasing and the funding is just not keeping up with the needs. Over 200 million people are affected by some sort of humanitarian crises. 70 million people are on the run from these crises. The challenges of today are not the same challenges of when the humanitarian systems were set up decades ago. And I think everyone recognizes that. And at USAID, we take it very seriously, and we're trying to do both structural innovation internally, but we're also trying to tap the innovation of the private sector externally. Internally, we're doing such things as, we're going through a transformation or reorganization, and one of the most significant parts of that is we're combining our two separate offices that handle humanitarian assistance. We're combining them and creating a bureau which will elevate humanitarian assistance both within the agency as well as within the US government. To a higher status. Another thing that we're doing internally is that Administrator Green, Administrator of USAID, has launched an official private sector engagement policy where at all levels of the agency, both in development and in humanitarian assistance, we are trying to find better solutions to the problems and the challenges of today by engaging more with the private sector. And frankly, governments in general are pretty horrible at finding new solutions. We're not the place you go when you want to find innovation and solutions. And we recognize that as the US government, which is why we're pushing so hard to tap into the private sector. They have better solutions, there's better technology, there's better networks, there's better data, there's just better solutions in the private sector. In one respect, we're seeking greater collaboration with the private sector with design and implementation of our programs. We have a new donor policy where we're trying to bring in new, partners that aren't traditional USAID implementing partners, that we're trying to expand our base within the private sector. So that's one aspect internally, but we're also trying to engage even more externally. And one example is the Humanitarian Grand Challenge. And it's something that's only been around for a couple of years, but in partnership with the United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Canada, we have been, we have this grand challenge. And what we do is we put a set of problems out into the community, to the private sector, and say, here are a set of problems, whether it's access problems, whether it's delivery problems, whether it's sectoral-based problems. And we're asking the private sector to pitch their ideas to us on how to meet those challenges. And we take the top innovations, we fund it, we pilot it, and if the evidence comes back and shows that we're actually solving those problems, then we grow and expand those solutions and we pepper it into all of our programming. And it's something we're really excited about. We've only been a few years. We've had about 1,500 applications from 86 different countries, and we're really excited about it, and we're already seeing the fruits of this being integrated into our programming, and the evidence has shown we are being more effective in our ability to meet these humanitarian challenges in the field.
Trey, thank you very much indeed. Let me press you a little bit. I mean, you are a funder, and the examples you gave indicate that you're seriously thinking of how you can fund better and achieve greater impact and help your partners better. How do you, but thinking a little bit more broadly about your fellow donors, a job that I used to do at one time, do you think that collectively the funders, without whom I think we would not be able to pay the bills, the billions of dollars, are they really serious about this? Because what we see is very often very traditional approaches, project documents, very elaborate bureaucratic processes, I'm sure that a significant proportion of staff of the receiving agencies, whether international organizations or NGOs, they're spending on writing reports and finding bureaucratic solutions. Tell us whether or not we're actually seeing a kind of innovation movement going on in the funding community, and how much we can challenge them, because, you know, for the receivers, often they're at the receiving end. It's not an equal power relationship. Those who give money and those who receive money, they are not on an equal relationship. How can we equalize that on a mutual respect, and how can we actually make sure that the funders are held accountable for modernizing their practices, which is a problem. And I'm not speaking about USAID. I'm wanting you to reflect generally on the funding environment.
So I think that's a really good set of questions. I think it all goes back to a couple of points. Number one, the challenges of today are not the same challenges when the humanitarian system was put in place. And number two, donors, AKA government, are really horrible at coming up with good solutions and innovative solutions. I think it's just going to take time for USAID and other like-minded partners. Our business model, we don't just write a check and walk away. We projectize. We go from project to project. We look at the evidence. We look at the data. We look at the proposal. We have technical staff on board to see whether it passes the smell test. And we take it very seriously that we want to make sure that our funding is targeted to the most vulnerable, and it's actually getting results. You can't do that if your business model is to write a check and walk away. And I think that is the direction that we're finding more and more donors. For example, even the organization that's hosting this conference, KS Relief, they have a similar business model where it's data-driven, where there's accountability, where there's transparency. Those things demand innovation. If you have transparency and accountability and you're not getting results, you're going to demand new solutions. So I think if having a more of a demand-driven approach or business model is going to be moving the community towards more of an innovative type of solution, because again, the systems that were created that are currently in place are not meeting today's challenges, and we need to find new, better ways to do it.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Let me just say to the audience, after the next speaker, I will invite one comment or question from the audience. So if you want to speak, get ready. Otherwise, we'll just carry on. And also, by the way, there are some free business class seats at the front. So no charge for coming and sitting here. So if people at the back want to come forward, especially young people and such like, then don't be shy. Let me turn now to our third speaker, who is Dr. Ghazi Idris Ibrahim, who is a program specialist, I think, with UNESCO.
Yes.
In education.
Yes.
Please.
Yes. Just, I want to share with you actually 3 programs running by UNESCO. I am in UNESCO regional office in Beirut, which is responsible for education in Arab states. So I want to get you back to the perspective what's going on in the region without going to the details. We all know what's going on. We work heavily actually in Lebanon as a host country, in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya. So there's 3 programs that we are focusing, which can be evidence-based and best practices. What we call in development is building resilient education system. And what we are doing in this, supporting these countries to build MS system and to include their national MS system with MS system just targeting refugees. And we are doing transition education plan, and here we have His Excellency, the Minister of Education in Yemen, and we are supporting Yemeni to develop their what we call TEP, Transition Education Plan, which is a roadmap for them to how they can work on with the children education, what are the problems, what are the challenges, and what are the suggested solutions. Our main program actually is what we call catch-up program. You can call it ALB, you can call it bridging. So the diversifying the delivery of education, in particular aiming to reintegrate children who are out of school in these countries or in host countries. And we start usually with what we call a framework. We build a framework with the country. We have finished actually 3 frameworks with Lebanon, with Syria, and with Yemen, and launched by the ministers of these countries, and in order to let them to understand what does it mean to cater for non-formal education and how non-formal education can be recognized and validated and accredited by the country in order to pave the road to establish a catch-up program. Actually, with the help of King Salman with the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, we have a successful program very close to what we call informal installment camps, and this has helped thousands of children to get back to schooling, and it is what we call King Salman and UNESCO schools. 3 schools now we have in area in Bekaa. In Yemen, we have a big program coming, and we have the minister will come to Beirut in order to put a plan to get a strategy for Yemen in order to get millions of children to come back to schooling through catch-up program. We finalize with them the TIB, we finalize with them the framework. Now is the time that we can come up together and try to work in order really to establish, to initialize a catch-up program in order to really develop several kinds of pathways. Community schools, some are going to be second chance, some are going to be a retention program for the children in order to let them to continue their education. Our third program is actually about psychosocial. I think we heard from yesterday and today a lot about the importance of psychosocial education and social emotional learning for the children. What we are doing in these countries, we have a back in training back for teachers at regional level, but we develop actually at the country level a booklet for the teacher in order to understand psychosocial. We don't want the teacher to be a psychiatrist, but at least we want the teacher to know the situation, the trauma that the children are facing, and to be aware and to do some kind of, to listen to the children, to use extracurricular activities as one way of relieving the pressure. So there are many kind of programs. Maybe later I can just give some more details.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I mean, you work in a very tough neighborhood where I think sometimes wars appear hopeless, and certainly they go on for a very, very long time.
Yes.
And yet, the purpose of education, as I see it, is to be resilient. But resilience is not just in the present, how to survive a conflict, whether it's Yemen or Syria or anywhere
Yes.
in the world, but how to actually prepare for the future. I must tell you my own profound little experience. I was a year or two ago in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, talking to Syrian refugees there. And I met this grandmother who had rescued her 10 grandchildren. She had lost other members of her family. And so, you know what she told me? That she wanted her 10 grandchildren, and she had plans for all of them. This one is going to be an engineer. That one is going to be a doctor. That one is going to be an architect. So she was very busy planning for the future.
Yes.
And she had absolutely no doubt that future was going to come.
Yes.
And that her children were going to be the future. And that taught me a profound lesson on the importance of education in terms of mental resilience and to keep hope alive. Let me just pause there. And as I said earlier, is there anyone out there with a burning point of view? Yes, sir, right here. Quickly, please, bring the microphone or whatever to the gentleman here at the front. Run.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this very important, I would say, topic to be discussed today. I would give my opinion regarding evidence-based professional practice in humanitarian intervention. I think our practice is too far away from evidence-based work. Actually, what we see is scattered work, probably some experiences here and there, trying to read their data and build sort of evidence-based work. What I would say that I think we need society or institution that really is aim and objective to build evidence-based professional practices in humanitarian intervention, like other specialty, like in medicine, like in dentistry, and other profession. I don't see right now any society or institute really devoted for this kind of work. I think there is basic things could be done in that area. For example, building a standard reporting in area of data, for example. And we don't see a standard uniform data reporting in different projects, actually. The data reporting is very confusing sometimes. And this is the first step, actually, to build sort of good analysis for the data, and then you can go and build your evidences and build your practices upon this. I think also the reporting sometimes by itself is sort of, shall we say, very defective. Sometimes you see some reports that is totally non-scientific, actually. Some of the agencies would like to keep their data for their own selves, you know. They don't share data with others. I think reporting data in a very scientific way, sharing data, analysis of data probably is, shall we say, the first step to build this kind of practices. But at the end, I would say we need an institute or society, actually, to work together with all the organizations to build this kind of practices, which really we are in need right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for raising a very practical point, and I hope Case Relief will kind of take a lead also in this in this area. Let's come back to that very important follow-on point. Let me turn next to Arfan Ali, who is in the UN Human Settlements Program.
Thank you so much. I represent the United Nations Human Settlement Program, UN Habitat, which is the organization responsible on urban areas and cities in the system, advocating together with other organizations for the implementation of SDG 11 and other relevant urban indicators under the different SDGs, knowing that more than 2/3 of the SDGs have urban indicators or urban components. The point that I want to address related to our region, because I work for the Arab region, for this region, and this region is facing huge challenges. Since 2011, conflicts in the Arab region have severely affected the cities in our region. This has resulted in huge human and financial losses, unprecedented destruction of infrastructure, housing, unprecedented also displacement into our cities and our urban areas. Municipal basic services in the region, in our cities in the Arab region, have often broken down, leading to interruption or disruption of the delivery of the basic services. Furthermore, in most of these cities, conditions leading up to the conflict in our cities, such as poverty, informal settlement, or unequal access to services in these cities, have exacerbated the impact of the conflict in our region. So through our work, through our role as a humanitarian and development agency in the UN system, we have identified 5 main challenges encountering us in the region with regard to our response in the urban context. First, we are talking about non-functional municipal structure. This non-functional municipal structure creates information gap to respond to the needs, as the main processes for managing basic services have broken down. There is very little information coming out from the government partners to on the cities, and this makes it very difficult also for anyone initiating projects with that have sense, projects that do no harm, projects that have best results for the response. Second, due to these constraints, recovery and reconstruction later happen at later stage and also on an ad hoc basis. It is difficult, it's very difficult for donors to identify the best ways to support on recovery and later on reconstruction, because as intervening in cities is not as clear cut as intervening in the rural areas. Also, as mentioned, in almost all cities affected by conflicts, there are also long-term challenges such as poverty, poor urban growth management, and unequal access to services such as housing. So this is made worse during the conflict. And for example, in areas where we have large damage or destruction on the housing sector, and at the same time this area where we had already previously shortage in the housing delivery or the housing stock. This is another cause for enduring conflict in these cities or in these areas. Also, fourth, the coordination mechanisms and platforms focus mainly on a humanitarian response. These responses often have difficulties to appreciate the cities and neighborhood scale, as they are not designed to address response at or to coordinate response at this scale. But however, the lived experience of people is on the neighborhood level. So, in order for people to return to their cities and their neighborhoods, IDPs or migrants or refugees, they are in dire need for a coherent response on this level that can address multiple sectors. So these are the challenges that we wanted to highlight and to address the next point on the innovative tool.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Irfan. I think you make a very good point. Today, most people live in cities. Today, it is in the cities that I think wars are often decided. And it's very, very important to increase the resilience of urban populations so that they can actually survive the particular forms of damage that take place in urban areas. So my question for you is, it's one thing to kind of rebuild and reconstruct and all those kind of things. But we know in the building profession, things take years and decades. You can destroy in minutes, but it'll take decades to rebuild. What can you do in innovation terms to help people cope with living in the ruins of cities, even as destruction is taking place, and even if you're in the recovery phase, but it's going to take a lot of capital investment and a lot of urban infrastructure renewal, but people have to live. They have to live in the present, not in the future. Any ideas, innovative ideas?
Actually, it's very difficult to talk about innovative ideas without showing things, without the visual help. So I should be innovative in explaining what are we doing to respond to these challenges. So we try to develop a new tool to help to respond to the needs in the urban context. So we developed what we call the urban profiling methodology. This methodology is planned to respond to enduring conflict in the urban areas, in the urban context. So to address the urban recovery needs using a three-pronged approach that consists of analysis, monitoring, and planning for recovery. The urban profiling is a tool that provides the initial analysis in this approach, which is followed by monitoring through data platforms, and to be complemented by comprehensive planning to help on the recovery of the damaged or destroyed areas. So the urban profiling is a collaborative process for collecting and analyzing data on the conditions of the urban context and the neighborhood. It creates baseline, the baseline on the current urban context, providing insights on the impact on the high impact of the conflict on the lives of people. It helps also to identify high impact interventions that can accelerate the urban recovery. In this region, we worked in 7 countries to produce the urban profile, profile using the mentioned methodology, the 3-pronged approach. The main component of this is the common analysis framework, covering 7 main urban pillars, including housing, infrastructure, basic services, economy, governance, civil society, environment, and cultural heritage. We analyze these pillars through a combination of literature review, consultation workshops, remote sensing tools, data collection through, for example, key informant interviews. Consultations also are extremely important in the process for the verification of the different products. So I had prepared many examples to present from Mosul when we developed the Mosul city in Iraq, when we developed the damage assessment using a drone and remote sensing tool. Then we did the consultation in order to produce and to do the verified damage maps and to make it available on the Mosul data portal. Also, consultation are extremely important to gain insights on the population movement, because the population movement in the urban conflict are mainly known to locals. So we have identified the movement of the people in the context of Mosul that led to the takeover in 2014 by ISIL. I have other examples. I can return to these examples in this context.
Thanks a lot. Very informative. Let me turn next to Dr. How do you pronounce it? Tanya Mirza, who is from Tanjina Mirza, who is from Plan Canada.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank His Excellency for a very timely humanitarian forum, and especially the organizers. And Dr. Amal, I want to thank you for organizing a session on evidence and research. It's really a huge gap, and sir, you mentioned it earlier as well. The gap in research and evidence in humanitarian sphere is enormous, so my big thanks to you. For my topic, I wanted to highlight a very special subgroup of population in humanitarian crisis that's not been addressed. Yesterday, we talked about youth bulge. The world has the largest cohort of young people entering in this world. It's the largest ever in humankind. Half of those youth are girls, are adolescents. Yet, very little study, very little literature, very little is said about the adolescent girls in crisis. And there are about more than 40 million of such girls who are in this space right now. So Plan International, we work with children, we work with girls and youth, and especially with adolescent girls. We decided to conduct a study about what are the special vulnerabilities, what are their experiences, what are the risks, and what can we do about it. So a study was conducted last 2 years in 3 crisis areas. Number 1, Lake Chad Basin, so the Sahel region. Number 2, the South Sudanese refugees crisis spilling over to Uganda and Ethiopia. And thirdly, the Rohingya crisis of the Rohingyas coming in Bangladesh. So this study was a very well-structured study. quantitative data as well as qualitatively, and talking with the girls themselves to understand what are their risks, what are the problems and challenges, and what do they want to do. So I want to point a couple of key results from this study. Number one, there's a lot of fear among the girls in this age group. They are neglected because of the three vulnerabilities they face. First of all, they're female, they're young, and they're highly vulnerable to gender-based violence, to early forced marriage, to trafficking, exploitation, sexual and physical violence, and of course, being married off at a very early age and then becoming pregnant as adolescent girls as young as 13. And we all know that adolescent motherhood has high death risk among these girls. So the first question that we asked, what are their challenges? The biggest challenge the girls notified is that they cannot go to school. Only 0.1% of the Rohingya girls were studying, 0.1%. Similar in the Sahel region and in South Sudanese refugees, majority of these girls are totally illiterate. So, and this is the reality of the picture. They're frightened, they stay within their homes, and their parents become overprotective because they're scared of sexual and physical violence. They're isolated, they stay home. Yet, almost all of them want to study, and I think you also highlighted, Dr. Mukesh, that there's an aspiration that they would like to continue the studies. The third point that came out of this study is that isolation and fear, there's a total loss of agency. These girls feel lack of empowerment, lack of agency, lack of decision-making. As a result, they're very vulnerable within their communities. Almost 40% of these girls actually witness violence right in their homes. So not only outside in the camps or in the cities or where they live, but right in the homes, physical violence, sexual violence. In all of these three areas, early marriage is a very norm in almost all of these three regions of crisis. But in the refugee setup, in crisis setup, the whole issue of early forced marriage is highly exacerbated. And it makes sense for the parents because there's one less mouth to feed, there's one less headache for a girl to worry about. So I don't want to conclude without giving some positivity. These girls can be hugely powerful. We talked in the last session about the change in breaking the cycle of poverty and marginalization. It's girls' education. If the girls can be kept in schools and studied, not only they become empowered themselves, they're empowering their communities and families. And demographic studies previously have shown that if there's one variable that can break the intergenerational cycle of poverty and violence, it's girls' education. So keeping the girls in refugee crisis situation, girls in school, is not only important for her, but they are our champions of change and future leader. So I don't want to conclude as making these girls just victim. They are powerful and huge champions of change in breaking the intergenerational cycle of violence and poverty. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanjina. This is a very critical topic. Now, I've got two challenging questions for you. Not one, which is, men are weaker, so they only got one question each. Women are stronger, they get two questions. My first question is, you're surrounded by men here on this panel and elsewhere. I'm afraid we're still that kind of society globally. Women talking about the problems of women and girls isn't necessarily going to sort what is a human problem for the whole of humanity. So what do you want to say to the men in this room and the men beyond? What is their role in this, and how can they do it innovatively and effectively? Number two, it needed an adolescent girl called Greta to suddenly disrupt the world on climate change and all the strikes that are going on. Now, you said at the end that adolescent girls can be powerful. I don't see that. I don't see the adolescent girls being being powerful in practice. It's good to have that aspiration. When are we going to see more voices of the adolescent girls themselves? Now, I'm not advocating that they should all strike from school and start agitating on the streets, but maybe that is what is going to be required. I don't know. So push yourself a little bit more and tell us, what can men do? And two, how can we actually empower girls to find their voices and project it across the world?
I didn't expect easy questions from you. So thank you for that question. I think there is, I shouldn't say lack of understanding, but not an accurate understanding of what gender means. Gender is not just about girls and women. Gender is about balance between men and women, girls and boys and young men. So I just wanted to get that clear. And Plan International has done is we do a lot of work on gender empowerment. And the last 4 or 5 years, we have invested heavily in engaging young men, young boys, and what we call champions of change model. This is not about girls only. When we are talking about empowerment of girls and women, men are equally at stake. It's not just a social issue, it's the right thing to do economically. And places and studies where we have seen that men are engaged. Men means starting from young boys on masculinity, on social cohesion, etc. These are the engagement of men that are needed, not only for families and individual and community, but as well as society. We have so many examples of fathers' clubs, male engagement, young champions of change, where men are equally invested in this. It's not about men or women or girls or boys separately. So I want that leave the message very clearly that the whole gender studies is now looking at male engagement with much more important. So it's not about us and them, it's how do we work together to empower both sides. And we have studies where the entire gender programming targeting adolescent girls was targeting young boys. And those traditional cultures where we have talked with religious leaders who often are men, religious village elders who are men, and household where father or the husband or the brother is the decision making, those top programs that targeted the men had the highest, better outcome in results for gender empowerment. So I wanted to get that across.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The second question you asked me.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Yes, you had a double question for me. The second question is, how do we empower adolescent girls? There's enough evidence to say you don't need to go to strike. Yes, I really respect the environmental movement now, but the young girls we are talking about in Sahel, in Rohingya crisis, in all of this programming, even in South Ugandan refugees, we have seen that when adolescent girls are given the safe space, safe places to study and talk, they are amazing, powerful voices. So you don't need to go to the streets. These are built in our programmings. They're not just Plan International programs. There are many other agencies who are in building the voices of girls and women. And this whole study was about the voices of girls. Yes, you are right. There's not enough of those studies. We are actually embarking a new study in Mali for girls' education and funded by Dubai Cares and INE with the university to showcase what is actually happening to girls' empowerment. What are the trajectory of girls' empowerment and how can we give voice? So this will be a very good studies, but you're right. There's not enough evidence to showcase how exactly should be done. There are pilot studies. I would love at the end of this conference that we commit to adolescent girls and learn and decide how to scale it up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for bringing out the point that there are many ways of doing empowerment. Empowerment has to be culture specific. And there are many ways of doing innovation. And innovation is also culture specific. There isn't one method. However, at the same time, all these different cultures have to be empowered to address a common challenge, in their own ways and to be able to connect across each other. And this is where evidence and so on comes in. Now, before I turn to my next speaker, again, after the next speaker, the floor will be open for one person who wants to say something. The gentleman in the front, but any ladies are also welcome to speak. So get ready and get the microphone. My next speaker is David Harden, who is the Managing Director of the Georgetown Strategy Group. David, it must be a great thing to come in the morning, sit at the desk and strategize. So I'd love a job like that. So tell us, how are you working for better strategies, more innovative strategies for more effective practice in the humanitarian sphere?
Thank you. The audience, I have a quick question for you. Do you remember in March of 2018 when Elon Musk shot the rocket up in the air and brought it back down on the pad? Do you remember that? It was a stunning, iconic moment. And I was in government at that point. I was in Jeddah at the Yemen Affairs Unit looking at the Yemen crisis. And it was at that moment I decided to quit government. So Elon Musk was doing space. Space is government work. Space is publicly funded. And yet he was doing all of this privately. And I decided that I wanted to disrupt the humanitarian system because I think actually the humanitarian system is a dinosaur. I think it will be slayed like every other industry in the last 50 years. I think it will be dramatically different in the next decade. You know, we sit around, and I became an entrepreneur. I have a tech team in Ramallah, and I'm building products and applications that are designed for this space. But why do I say that the humanitarian system is antiquated, obsolete? I mean, I was in government for 22 years. I know the UN system. I know the World Bank system. I ran billions of dollars for USAID. And now as a private sector entrepreneur, I find it impossibly difficult to break through the regulations, the procurement process, the slowness. The government, the donors, they tend to buy process and projects. They don't buy results. They don't buy outcomes. They may get outcomes, but they're not buying results. And that's not what the future is going to be. So I decided that, that the future is going to be run by entrepreneurs who can take these problems and produce the results in a way that will be more efficient and more impactful than the current big donor structure. And lastly, I'll just point out that with the advent of decentralized technology and the massive rise of private capital, that's something that's completely missing in this current humanitarian structure. Nobody here represents private capital. But when you get private capital aligned with talent and markets and skills and context, you can provide the results that will make a difference in Yemen or Syria or elsewhere in the world.
Great. Thank you very much. So tell me, what's the incentive? I mean, you know, it's great to disrupt, but the disruptee, you know, which is basically organizations and individuals who are having a very nice life, thank you very much. Things have been working quite well for them as an institution or as individuals for the last kind of lifetime. And I speak as a person who's been in this business for 30 years. Well, I hope I still remain disruptive despite having gray hair. But what I have learned is that actually the incentives are not there to be innovative and disruptive. And if you become disruptive and innovative, then you're on your way out. So I don't know what kind of strategizing you have in terms of empowering the change makers through the processes of, in a sense, policy making, strategizing, partnership building, getting private capital and public capital together in a way that is a win-win for all.
Yes, that's a great point. So we have WFP here. How much would WFP pay to minimize the diversion of food aid in Yemen? Okay, so just take for a second, 30% of all food aid would be diverted. What if I could provide a solution that would reduce that from 30% to 10%? And what if that solution cost you 2%? Would WFP be interested? Would Trey Hicks be interested? Because Trey represents the American taxpayers. The American taxpayers don't want to have food diverted into bad actors' hands. And if I could convince Trey that I have a product that would make a difference, I think Trey would be interested as well. And you know what? The profit margin in all of this isn't a bad thing. The profit margin will fuel the innovation and the impact that could be transformative. So I don't make any bones about the fact that, look, I have venture capital investors. At the end of the day, they want a result. And that means a monthly result, a quarterly result, a yearly result. And that means that if I can deliver a product to WFP that will reduce diversion from 30% to 10%, they would be interested in doing that.
Great, thank you very much. One or two comments, please, sir.
Dr. Kapila?
Yeah.
May I come in as WFP?
Okay. Why don't you speak first, Dominic, while we get the microphone to the person in the audience. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Dr. Kapila, you are moderating and you're steering this so elegantly, and I thank the gentleman in the audience that challenged the practices on evidence-based programming, and now the entrepreneur here challenging. And you said it, Dr. Kapila, when you innovate too much, you're probably already outside. And if you see my banner there in the back, Innovation Accelerator, we wanted to create that space where venture capitalists, where research centers, where UN agencies, where the private sector, they come together and solve exactly the issues that the gentleman was raising, so that we do not have the diversion, so that we do not have the complacency, so that we serve at best. We're not there yet, but 10 days ago, I was sitting in a room with a venture capitalist. He was talking about the wealth that you were describing, trillions in wealth by in the private sector that through evidence-based interventions can lead to profit for them and solutions for affected populations. I think we are on that journey. The accelerator is only one of the things. We super treasure the work that we have done with USAID on humanitarian grand challenge. Probably we have a huge defect. We're not telling the story enough. So I will take from this panel here a commitment of working better and informing the public much more about the journey that we're doing. We're not at the levels that the medical sector, the health sector is, but certainly we're not at the complacency humanitarian public sector only. Over.
Thank you very much, Dominic, for that good reminder and for still being with us. By the way, I'm very struck by a very good connection with Rome. It's good. I feel you're here in the room, because usually my experience of these events is that the link breaks and we can't hear. So my compliments to the technical team, both in Rome and in Riyadh, to keep us on the same wavelength. I think
certainly with the heart, I am in the room.
Yes, that's right. So I think the gentleman here wanted to say something.
Oh, thank you very much.
Or lady. Where are they?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right. I am Millat Mustafa from Case Relief in Monitoring and Evaluation Department. Yep. Actually, I want to focus on this evidence-based humanitarian intervention, some challenges at micro level. First of all, if we go for any evidence-based intervention, what we need is data, qualitative and quantitative both. For the qualitative data, we need some smart indicators. But the big challenges that we face, and I'm sure if any specialists are here, they will also agree with me, is For the implementing partners, we have seen for the same type of project, even in the same area or different areas, they are using different types of indicators for the same type of project. First thing. Second is, even they are very reluctant to share some of the information with the donors because they said it is just like confidentiality, this and that, right? So when we just try to collect the data, we have to either trust on their presentation. We don't have any access to their documentations where we can just verify the data or the data quality. This is first thing. And then for this evidence-based, as I said, this quantitative data, we cannot maintain any standard. Because for the same type of project, we are getting the data from, on different indicators, okay? Actually, I had a chance to work for USAID in two countries, in Bangladesh and in DRC, in a platform project. What I found, they have got the best system. First of all, they have got their own performance management system where they have got some standard indicators. Any IP or implementing partner wanted to implement any particular project, they have to select the indicator from their list, standard indicators. They can have their own custom indicators, no problem. So at Case Relief now, we are trying to establish some sort of things like that so that all our partners, whoever they just implement any project in a particular sector, they have to select some of our core indicators and they can have their own indicator, we don't mind. Now, second thing is regarding the innovation. I think there are lots of innovations happening in the field by the IPs themselves. They have their own system of research, own system of even applied research with the universities and others. But the big challenge is these are not shared at appropriate level. They have their own sharing mechanism within the organization, but if we consider among the organizations, there is still, we find it missing. Like we need a learning platform where we can share inter-agency experiences so that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So this is my comments, and if anybody can just put anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Especially, I think those were very real and very practical examples. And I think one of the outcomes we want from this is to how to set up a system. I'm a little bit depressed because in 2016, I was a special advisor to the UN for the World Humanitarian Summit, the world's first World Humanitarian Summit. And I remember discussing these issues and sessions and so on we had. And this is now 3-4 years ago, right? So in that sense, I think we really need to accelerate action in this particular area and go away from here with some, not just awareness, but with a new resolve. Let me turn now to our final couple of speakers. So, we have here then, where is my list of here? Yeah. So, Mohammed Abdikar, you are in IOM, in the office in Nairobi. So tell us.
Thank you very much, Mukesh. In 2016, we had the World Humanitarian Summit, and we all came up really excited about the new way of working, which I always say it's not new because we've been talking about this for a long time. The last 20, 30 years, most of us have been talking about humanitarian development peace nexus. Where have we reached on that? We as an organization dealing with mobility, transition and recovery, development side, but also on the migration side. We work on both the humanitarian side and the development side. The bigger issue we always have in the field when you go to, let's say, South Sudan, or you go to Somalia, or even you go to Colombia or Turkey with the Syrian refugees, is a question about how the problem we have in trying to implement the humanitarian principles, the international humanitarian law, but at the same time international human rights law, where you're going to have the humanitarian side of the organization saying you cannot go deal with non-state actors. How do you deal with the middle ground where in Somalia you'll have maybe 100 or 20 or 300 ex-Al-Shabaab fighters who've left Al-Shabaab and have come to join the government side of the program? How do you reintegrate a violent extremism group in the middle of a humanitarian response? And the question has always been, you'll find the humanitarian partner saying, we do not want to be part of this discussion, while we always continuously push for the humanitarian development and peace nexus coming together. You can't deal with the peace side, you can't deal with the development side if you don't deal with the issue with Al-Shabaab, as an example. Exactly the same situation in Nigeria, where you have a large number of IDPs displaced, but the government does not have an IDP policy. How do you deal with an IDP policy? And at the same time, how do you deal with the situation where you have a large number of extremist groups, the Boko Haram, who are surrendering to the government, who require humanitarian assistance? How do you deal with that part of the extremist group? How do you deal with the part of the IDPs who require shelter, food, non-food assistance, and anything else is required to deal with that? So the middle ground has become an issue where you have the humanitarian side saying, we only deal with humanitarian principles. Then you have the development part of the side which do not show up as we need them. Then you have the government side, the whole of government approach, the donors. The donors come in saying, we are from ECHO, so we'll deal only with the humanitarian side of the programming. Then you have OFDA in the US government, which will come and say, we only deal with the humanitarian principle side of the programming. But you also have in USA the Transition Recovery, the OTI group of donors who come in and say, we need to work on the middle ground. We need to make sure that we're able to build the capacity of the government. But all this coming together is coming in a different sectors. It does not come as a joint whole of government approach to responding to crisis and new ways of working and how we do the humanitarian development peace nexus. So our question has always been, how do we work in Somalia, which is a, let's say, fragile country, 25 years of conflict? How do you bring the situation of Somalis on the ground when the African Union forces take over a village from Al-Shabaab, as an example? When does the humanitarian organizations come on the ground? The humanitarian organizations will say, we do not want to do that because we'll be seen to be supporting the offensive by the African Union and the Somali National Army. We've changed that now. We're saying because we need to work on the middle ground with UNDP and UN Habitat, we've set up a mid-NEMO program, which means as soon as a village is taken over, you quickly come in and ask the community what is needed. Is it health? Is it education? Is it food? And with that programming, you do a planning together much quicker with other organizations, say you need to provide food, shelter, and others required. But in a country like Somalia, it's very fragile. So it means the government doesn't have the coordination structures in place, the capacity to deal with that. How do you be able to work with a government that doesn't have that coordination structure, but we want the government to be in the lead of dealing with that? Our evidence has shown that we have to look for a way of building that capacity. And that's why we sometimes appreciate the programs that come from, for example, the OTI kind of programming, which is build the capacity of the government to be seen in the front line. If you go to Colombia, it's a totally different story, where you have a large number of FARC rebels, but you have a very strong government that is coordinating the international community. And we are able to come up with strong reparations and victims reparations program. If you go to Turkey, as an example, they received 3.5 million refugees. But they have a strong government that was able to coordinate the international community. At the end of the day, just by doing a labor assessment survey with the government of Turkey, they were able to come up very quickly with a policy of employment of Syrian refugees, how they can get employment jobs and other support mechanisms for the Syrian refugees. So we compare the upper income countries like Turkey and Colombia, dealing with humanitarian development peace nexus. It's very key in making it work. How you're going to deal with the humanitarian development peace nexus in a country like Somalia or South Sudan, or even Mali right now, because of the weak government capacity, it becomes a bigger issue because instead of having the government leading that response and trying to make sure that everyone is in the train to be able to move this forward, what you have is the humanitarian side saying we only deal with humanitarian issues. Then you have the development side is able to deal with development issues, and the whole middle ground is forgotten, which is very much what we are trying to talk to everybody is that the humanitarian development peace nexus can only work when you first have a strong government. But how do you deal with the non-state actors like the Al-Shabaabs and the Boko Harams who are causing the displacement itself? And how do we strengthen the capacity of the whole of government approach? And how do we change the perception of the donors themselves that they need to come with a whole of government approach as well? We don't want donors to come and say, we'll only do humanitarian. We don't want to worry about the middle ground, and we don't want to worry about the development side.
Well, for that, we need a kind of innovation in the mindsets of people. But I think well said. But let me just challenge you on the core mandate of IOM, which is migration. Now, the world is on the move in record numbers, internally, externally, rural, urban, we talked a little about that, across countries, across continents, if you like. As a specialist in migration aspects of humanitarianism, peace, and development, where do you see the role of innovation? Are we, going to see any different, any new ways of managing migration? I'm not speaking in political terms, in terms of whether to let in people or not let in people. I'm speaking more about, is there a way of managing the flow of people in a way that is both humane as well as effective and empowers the migrant to be able to look after themselves while respecting the host community as well, whether they're internally displaced or externally displaced?
Thank you, Mukesh. That's a really good question. Just to give you an example, from the Horn of Africa, we see about close to 200,000 migrants crossing Djibouti and Somalia and the Red Sea, majority wanting to come to Saudi Arabia, just as an example. If you speak to them, when we meet them in Djibouti, what they say is, I'm leaving my country because of I have no job. It's a poverty issue. Most of the migrants, it's not because they're running because of persecution. It's very much about jobs and poverty in their own countries. The same thing when you talk about those who are in the Mediterranean, you have a large number of refugees who obviously are going because of persecution issues. They can't go back to their own countries. But you also have a large number of economic migrants from the West African countries. And you can see the same thing when you talk about the caravan from Mexico and Guatemala trying to go to the US. It's mostly about jobs, security, and violence. How are you going to deal with those issues? I think we need to rethink, when we talk about innovation, it's very much about, can we think more like what we've done with the Comprehensive Refugee Response Plan, which is very much, how do we give jobs to the refugees in the host country, but also make sure that the communities who are hosting the refugees have jobs as well. What we need to see in Ethiopia, where you have 150,000 migrants living in the country, is how do we create jobs in Ethiopia to avoid this large flow of migrants crossing the Red Sea to Yemen. Even in a conflict situation, we're getting about 150,000 every year crossing into the Red Sea. How do we create jobs? Very much about the poverty reduction, the SDGs that we need to work on. And we're having partnership with our agencies that we're also already talking to, the ICRCs, the WFPs, the UNHCRs, and the UNDPs, to look at the root causes of people leaving their countries. How do we deal with poverty? How do we all come together into this? And bring also the World Bank and the development donors into this discussion.
Thank you very much indeed, Mohammed. And before we come to our last speaker, I'm conscious of time, but we did start late. We started, I think, 15 minutes late, so we will finish 10 minutes late. Is that all right? Okay. So, and then as soon as our last colleague has spoken, again, the same approach. Very good to take one or two comments before we round up and finish. I know our friend in Rome has to go for his mid-morning cappuccino. You know, in Rome, in Italy, they take this very seriously. At 10:30, they must have their cappuccino. Otherwise, their human rights are denied. And of course, we need our human rights for lunch as well. So we'll do that. On that, later on, in final word. So let me turn now to Bogdan. Bogdan Dumitru is from the International Medical Corps, which I think, having seen some of their work on the ground myself in several continents, I don't want to flatter them too much in case they get too big a head, but I think, in my opinion, they are one of the most effective, solid organizations on the ground. You won't hear them very much from them. They're not singing their praises all the time, but they're solid workers in many, many countries across many continents. So Bogdan, really looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Kapila. I wish first to thank KSR for inviting us here. As Dr. Kapila said, we're probably not as well known as every other colleague that has spoken before or the previous day. But those of you who know us, they know where we operate and what we are doing. We're a medical frontline organization We've been operating in almost all the conflicts in the world in the last 30, 40 years, and we're providing an integrated package of emergency health, referral system from the frontline trauma centers, and we then continue rebuilding together with the authorities, ministries of health, or what is left of them following conflict, the backbone of the health system in the respective country or territory where the conflict or disaster has occurred. So our specificity is that we're trying as much as possible to work almost exclusively with local capacity while we're bringing in expertise from overseas only if and where it's necessary. That differentiates us also from other colleagues that are doing similar type of work in the sense that we're trying to build that sustainability right off the bat from the beginning, and therefore contributing also to a solution to this peace, development and humanitarian nexus that is being mentioned lately in several forums. So we do believe in that continuum right from the beginning, right from the start of our emergency response, from our medical mobile teams which are providing that kind of immediate assistance on the front line or in the immediate areas that are affected by conflict or violence or disaster. We're building that element of sustainability right from the beginning. Providing innovative solutions could be looked at in several ways, programmatically, technically, and here I would like to mention our specific work in mental health and psychosocial support. Obviously, we all know what the result of an explosive ordnance falling in a city is. We've seen that numerous times on TV. We've seen the physical effect, we've seen the damage, we've seen the infrastructure being obliterated, we've seen lives being shattered. What we are not seeing is another silent killer in today's world. We're talking about this coronavirus, which is in itself a silent killer. We talk about it, we know it exists, we don't know what it is, and we do not see it. There is another silent killer out there, not necessarily only in conflict and disaster, but across our entire world, and that's the mental health. That's our psychosocial state. That's our mental well-being. Very rarely we see people talking about it, particularly in our area of operation here in the Middle East, but also across many other geographical areas. There is a certain stigma associated with mental health. People do not easily open up about that, particularly, I would say, those responsible for their families or for their communities. We are stressed when we receive an email from our boss at 10 in the evening asking us where were we yesterday when we were to deliver a report, aren't we? Well, imagine how much more of a stress you are from having constantly been displaced and redisplaced, being a refugee, being an internally displaced person, fleeing constantly for the last 9 years in a conflict like Syria. We have refugees in Turkey, 3.7 million plus. We have refugees in Iraq. We have refugees in Jordan. We have refugees in Lebanon. There are millions of people who are also displaced internally within Syria. All those categories of population, they certainly suffered a significant psychosocial and mental health impact. It is, unfortunately, almost exclusively negative, and it has been identified through various studies run by WHO, by IMC, by the local health networks that were remaining operational, as being one of the first and the most important support that needs to be provided to this type of population. This is part of human being, it's part of the needs, it's part of the rights, and we need to take it into account. And therefore, where the innovation comes from, you may ask yourself, is from the fact that by providing this medical emergency assistance on the front line and in the immediate proximity, we have associated mental health and psychosocial support interventions together, and we have even included also elements of gender-based violence, clinical management of rape, and all that. That is because of the stigma that's associated with these issues. It is also because of the fact that people do not necessarily want to disclose that in an environment that's only set for that particular type of response, but through a visit to one of our clinics or through a visit by one of our mobile medical units, you can actually be made aware and have access to those services in full confidentiality and without anybody else needing to know what exactly is the real reason why you are there. And to socialize that within the communities that we work, obviously we have developed what we call a community health-based team that's going around either settlements of refugees, IDPs, communities, and so on, which are actually individually visiting every family in those locations and explaining them what kind of services are available at our facilities. Now, one of the reasons, Dr. Kapila, that we are not so well known is because we do not talk about what we are doing. We do not like to be on TV as much as others, because that negatively impacts our ability to operate across very sensitive and delicate and complex environments. And that is the reason why our work is so little known. But we certainly hope that you will help us change that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bogdan. I think you work in very difficult circumstances, and you bring help and hope to people under most desperate conditions. That much is clear. Now, the difference between now and, say, 20 years ago, and I'm very kind of feel positive about that difference, is that 20 years ago, people who were caught up in crises and conflicts, we waited for the conflict and crisis to pass so that they could resume their trajectory towards development. At least that was the kind of a simplistic idea one had of relief development. It was not about a nexus. It was about a sequence, in a way. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, they talk about leaving no one behind. And Sustainable Development Goal 3 talks about universal health coverage, which means universal health coverage for people directly, the millions that you were talking about, tens of millions. So let me ask you, because you are our medical organization here, what's your thinking? If ever we need innovation, it is in the area of how to bring about universal coverage for the people who are inaccessible. And they need not just basic health care, they need the latest in science and technology to be brought to them. So this is where innovation comes in, because meanwhile, our advances in science and technology, especially in the medical sciences, has advanced so much that things are possible now that were not possible before. And I'm reminded in this about soldiers and civilians. Today, for a soldier to die in a war is very rare, unless a bomb lands on their head, and that's, they die and no one can do anything. But today, if a soldier is rescued by the medical services of the army concerned of that country, they very rarely die. Survival is almost 100%. While in the case of civilians caught in conflicts, it's about at least 90% likely to die if you happen to be injured, if you are very sick, etc., etc. And how did the armed forces, medical and health services do that? They innovated a lot in the way they organized their healthcare services in the moment of greatest crisis for them. Now, I don't want to use a military example too much, but in this case, it's an inspirational example, seeing just because civilians are caught up in wars, just because civilians are caught up in disasters, it does not automatically follow that they have to suffer. It does not automatically follow that they have to die, because we have the means and the capabilities at our disposal to do that. And that's where we need the innovation more than anything else. So, sorry, I'm not the one giving speeches, but you are. So tell me, how is IMC going to innovate to bring about universal health coverage to your most difficult to reach populations?
Any more challenges, Dr. Kapila, for me? Well, I think with respect to accessing almost impossible location, we call that hard-to-reach areas in a very diplomatic way, because they're actually active conflict area, and sometimes even the participants of the conflict, they do not know who exactly it is that they are fighting against. So having access to those areas, for us, the only way in is the acceptance of the warring parties or combatants or groups engaged in armed operations, but also particularly the local communities. You have to have the trust of those communities and of those actors if you are to access this area. And the innovation is your ability to negotiate, actually, and to convince all these parties to the conflict or being affected by conflict that you are actually there to deliver the proper emergency services in a neutral and impartial way. So there is not much innovation in mentioning the principles of humanitarian assistance. They remain the same. How do you do it, and the capacity that you need also to actually make sure that you manage to save everybody that needs to be saved in an active conflict situation. That's more of a creativity, innovation, building reputation, credibility, and being able to deliver that result that one of my colleagues here was mentioning, and proving it to the donors such as KSR, USAID, or DFID, and to also the specialists in the sectors who are constantly monitoring us, such as yourself, Dr. Kapila, who hold us responsible for delivering that result. And that's where efficiency and effectiveness comes into play. Now, it is very difficult to invent something better than a rescue team on a helicopter covered by F-16. We do not have that. But what we have is road ambulances, we have dedicated drivers who speak multiple languages, we have doctors and nurses who are ready to go into the battlefield, ready to recover those immediate trauma casualties, bring them to a stabilization center that's usually as close as possible, if not on the front line itself, sometimes protected by those warring groups, and then following that, referring them to probably a field hospital that's again in the nearest place. Front lines today are very flexible. They can change overnight. There is quite a lot of hardware from a military perspective involved. And our capacity, unfortunately, remains somewhere in the area of 1980s and 1990s, where it is mostly our dedication as humanitarian workers that allows us to conduct those rapid emergency interventions.
Great. Thank you very much. In fact, to stay flexible is itself an innovation in a world that is more and more rigid, and in a world where there are too many boundaries. Now, we're about to finish. But as promised, there's maybe space for a couple of people, and we have some gentlemen in uniform, so at least I've got to let them speak, and then one or two others. So please, no more than 1 minute each, if you possibly can, and then we will sum up and conclude. I think there was someone there first. Microphones, please. Please stand up. Oh, you got one. Yeah. Good. And if you can, sorry, I should have said this at the beginning, just give us your name as well, if you can, and what you do. Another microphone? Okay. Well, why don't you come here? Right.
All right.
Shout.
Thank you. My name is Yasser Tabara. I'm with the American Relief Coalition for Syria. I'm a Syrian American. It's an umbrella organization for 11 Syrian American organizations that provide relief and development aid in Syria. Just throughout the discussion, and just going back to the topic of the session, you know, when we're talking evidence-based, the question of priority always came to my mind. What are the criteria that are used to determine the priority of a humanitarian catastrophe? For example, right now we have the disaster, the humanitarian disaster, biblically proportioned humanitarian disaster of IDPs in northern Syria. And at the same time, there are a number of other catastrophes that are taking place in the world. Has there been an attempt to have an international conference or a national treaty that actually sets the criteria to deal with these catastrophes from a point of view of priority. And obviously, political considerations are always there. And having listened to Dave's intervention, which was very impressive actually, from my perspective, and the innovation of the private sector, the introduction of private sector into the world of humanitarian assistance, perhaps that could be the element that takes away the political considerations out of the setting the priorities of dealing with humanitarian disasters. I just wanted to put that question out there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And to one of our generals in the front.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Major General Abdullah Al-Hubabi, Civil Military Operation in the Joint Command. My question based on the name of the session, which is evidence-based practice. You know, whereas we all work in the man-made crisis, so the difficulty comes on the people in the field. The rules and regulation sits by the COs in the big office in the capitals. My question is, now, you know, sharing experience in the field is not easy between companies, between a humanitarian organization. So nobody will give you his secrets. So there should be a place which deal with everybody working in the humanitarian sector, like OCHA. My question, how do you evaluate the role of OCHA dealing to transfer and to have a mutual support between the humanitarian organization in the field? My question to Mr. Dave Harden. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I think it would be, okay, please. Speak, yeah.
Hello. Thank you. I think my question is quite complementary with the two other ones, and I'm very happy that a lawyer and then a military person took part of this conversation, because you've been talking about collecting the data and you emphasized on the fact to get the study. So I'm very curious about what kind of profile the NGOs and the organization needs to work with them, because it requires so many qualifications that are very cross-functional, and also some capacity of understanding, empathy, and the fact to collect the data. So what kind of process and what kind of recruitment do you need? What kind of people do you need on the ground to work with you? Do you need local people? Do you need, because I see that you work on very different countries with different cultural background. So are you thinking about, in terms of human resources, how do you think about that?
Okay, so in order to manage this, let's handle it this way. I'm going to give each person 30 seconds each. If I say 30 seconds, they'll take 45, so I have to go 30 seconds each. For them to address any of the questions or to say anything they like, but that's your final word on this subject. And let's start in reverse order. So the last person who spoke was Bogner. So why don't we start with you, and then we'll work our way up, and we'll end up with Rome.
Thank you,
take these questions on board. Don't have to answer them if you don't know how to answer them, but whichever question you can answer, answer.
Right. Thank you. I don't think anybody knows how to answer all of them, but I will do my best. To my colleagues that work in northeastern Syria, I think there is a lot of political efforts done currently within the structures that we have internationally, the United Nations and other working groups that are trying to actually put an end to what's going on as we speak in northwestern Syria. I hope they will be more successful than the previous attempts. But our role, our primary role as humanitarian organization is actually to deal with the effects of that while we're advocating, of course, for a long-lasting political solution to a military confrontation. To Your Excellency, the Major General, who's been obviously on the same front lines as many of us here, I think your approach to coordination, something similar to command and control, is extremely important. We all have our own strengths, but we all have our own weaknesses as agencies. Some of us are better in emergencies, some of us are better in transitional Some are better in building peace, some are better in protection, and so on. I think that's a very essential point. I cannot speak on behalf of my OCHA colleagues, but I think they've been playing a wonderful role throughout the Middle East, at least in the past few years since we experienced this conflict. And with respect to the human resources, there is absolutely no difference between the capacity that you need, whether it's local or international, as you refer to it. It is the capacity you need, and I would say it's 99% local capacity that you need and that you want to ensure that there is that understanding, that there is that language skill, that there is that communication according to the local customs and traditions and the community expectations.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bogdan. 30 seconds, Mohammed.
First, when we talk about, a lot of data has come up. In the humanitarian context, we do have data, and we share with everyone, including the military, if they're interested. And that is through our displacement tracking metrics, which is in almost every country that has a conflict right now or natural disasters. There is data available in the humanitarian context, which is how many people require shelter, how many people require food, working very close with WFP, with their SCOPE system itself. That is available, I think, on that. On the other ones, the humanitarian development piece is a different issue. The second very important point is about, we talk about evidence-based and research funding. The problem is there is not enough donors who will fund research in the field. So we'd like to look at the governments here and the donors. How much do you provide, just like the prevention strategy, how much do you provide for prevention? How much do you provide for research funding? And we need to look at that. On that question about the scale of the crisis, I think we've talked about the last many years within the UN system, classifying an emergency as a level 3 or level 2 or level 1, but we've realized it's even causing more problems as well. Because once we say crisis in Syria is level 3, then all donors are interested in Syria, and everybody forgets about South Sudan, everybody forgets about other countries as well. How to balance that will always be a problem for us.
Great. Thank you very much. David, 30 seconds.
Thank you. So I'm deeply skeptical about the data that we currently collect. I think it could be done a lot better. I think, for instance, we're working on a data collection, omni-channel communication product that will allow us to collect data at the 2G, 5G level, low literacy, high literacy, no internet, definite internet. I think big data needs to be collected at the crowdsource level, at the responder level, and kind of coupled with some remote sensing capabilities. You had raised a question about civilians. I think that it's very easy now to set up a blockchain target deconfliction mechanism that would make it neutral and unimpeachable on targeting and reduce civilian risks. That technology exists right now. It hasn't been applied in this context. There was a question too about, I just want to kind of highlight one additional point, and that's the trust gap, which came up, credibility gap. Listen, everybody in this room, they get in cars of people they don't know. They stay in houses of people that they've never met before, and they give them money in advance. That's Airbnb and Uber. You could envision kind of a crowdsourced, NGO-sourced, local-sourced trust gap that would be able to conclude where there's verifiable, good, big data. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Maybe the time for crowdsourcing humanitarian action needs to be developed further. Tanjina, 25 seconds.
Yes, I'll only answer the question the lady raised about data. I have actually very different views from what was shared. I think data has become a tool for upward accountability only. It goes to the donor, satisfies the donor for more money. I think this is not the right way. That could be one way. The most important accountability is sharing the data with the people we are serving. What do they want from this data? How can we share with the men and women and children in their terms, not in scientific, because it's about their lives, it's their point of view. So how to build local capacity to collect and share. I keep on emphasizing the word share to the people we serve, not to always the master of the money. And that mechanism does not exist, and we need to find, and it has to be in the sharing and development of local capacity, not somewhere in Washington, not in Canada, not in New York. It has to be local data collection, shared in their terms, and for them it is about downwards accountability, not just upward. Thank you.
Thanks. Irfan.
Two comments on the point from the gentleman in the King Salman Center on the data, the monitoring of the data. I would like to invite you to refer to the Resilience and Recovery Data Platform in Iraq. It's public, it's open, it includes all projects from by NGOs, by UN agencies, by the government in both phases, in humanitarian response and in recovery. This is public and open now in Iraq. 5 other platforms are open for Syria, for Libya, for Lebanon, for Yemen. For Yemen, it will be functioning soon. I can also have further discussion on this with you to respond to your question. The other point from the Syrian organization NGO, as Mohammed referred, there are very rigorous mechanisms in the UN system to set up the prioritization system of the humanitarian response and to continue reviewing the response, the humanitarian response under the Interagency Standing Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Hegazi.
Just I want to answer the question of our colleague from Saudi Arabia, the military general. Yes, we have a problem actually in sharing information. And he's right of saying that there is a challenge. But OSHA is doing a good job, but it is not enough. I think we need to find a way of really sharing information with the donor, with everybody. I don't think the problem is with that we hide the information on purpose. I don't think this is the reason. It's maybe lack of time. Maybe our concern is to deliver, to help the people without really giving the time for good documentation of things.
So, Trey, and then to you, Dominic, your time is even more compressed.
Sure. So just to answer from a donor perspective how we prioritize our responses, at USAID, we do it multiple ways, but in the Office of Food for Peace, we have the Famine Early Warning System, which uses satellite data, we use economic data, we use crop yields, rainfall, to look at food security, and we do this regularly and ongoing so we can target where the most needs are. We also look at things like, we do projectized funding, so we don't do block grants, and we walk away for a few months and then come back. We do project by project, so if something comes up like the floods in South Sudan or the locusts or some drought or weather condition that acerbates an area, we can shift quickly because we don't give money out in blocks. We give it out per project, and it keeps us nimble. And we use zero-based budgeting every year. We look across the landscape, we use all the data, and we prioritize based on the data and meeting the needs.
Thanks a lot. A final sentence or two from you, Dominic, in Rome.
Thank you very much. Couple of sentences. One, thank you for all the inputs that were given. I have listened and we will factor them in. Second, the same passion that everyone has put into innovation, we need that same passion in the principle of collaboration. That will help us have the people, the resources, and the evidence for getting good programs. The third point, responsible use of data, involvement of the private sector. We need to be much more aggressive in pursuing the private sector that can solve challenges that the public sector or single institutions cannot. Thank you for having me on this panel, Dr. Kapila.
Thank you very much. 3 sentences in conclusion to try and summarize. Number one, humanitarian action is an art, but it's also a science. And I think if we do not invest in the science of humanitarian action, then I think we are going to fail our clients. And that science is not a science of medicine or education or new technologies. It is a science of humanitarian action. Second, a point made in different ways, we need institutional capacity building among organizations, whether it's institutes for data or whatever it is. And donors, therefore, have to invest in that. The number 3 point is, this is a matter of principle. We're all familiar with humanitarian principles, neutrality, impartiality, and so on. What about a new principle? That it is immoral and unethical to work in humanitarian area unless you're working scientifically and unless you're also working in a way where you are able to share your data we have for the collective group. Fourthly and finally, we need an enabling system-wide environment to do this. This cannot be done by an individual organization, an individual government, or an individual NGO. Therefore, it has to be a whole of system response. And that may be the manifesto to take forward from here, and in fact, what we request the KS Relief to take on as part of their plan of actions, their work ahead in the months and years ahead. Thank you very much, all very much.
And thank you very much. If the microphone could be activated again. Can we activate the microphones? Excellent. Thank you all so much. Excellent discussions, and thank you to Mukul Kapila. Now, lunch is being served downstairs. Can I ask you to return here at 2 o'clock for the panel, Health in the Humanitarian Context, Communicable Disease. It's going to be hosted by Elise Labat, who assures me that there will be references to the coronavirus, but it will not be about the coronavirus. 2 o'clock here, it's a date. I will see you later. Thank you.